In 1995, a man walked into a courtroom in Virginia with one of the strangest lawsuits in American legal history. The case was unusual not because of the amount of money involved, and not because of the crime, but because of who the man was suing. He was suing himself. And somehow, in a strange twist of legal logic, he actually won. The man's name was Robert Lee Brock, and at the time he was an inmate in a Virginia prison. Brock filed a handwritten lawsuit in federal court claiming that he had violated his own civil rights. According to Brock, while he was intoxicated, he broke into a house and committed a crime that led to his arrest and imprisonment. Because of his actions, he argued, he had violated his own religious beliefs and his own civil rights, and therefore he should be compensated for the harm that he had caused to himself. Brock demanded $5 million in damages. But there was a problem. Because Brock was in prison, he did not have any money. So in his lawsuit, he requested that the state of Virginia pay the damages on his behalf, since the state was currently responsible for his care while he was incarcerated. In other words, Brock was arguing that he had wronged himself, and since he could not pay himself for the damages, the government should pay him instead. At first glance, the lawsuit sounded ridiculous. It sounded like a joke, or an attempt to waste the court's time. But the case was filed in real court, and it had to be reviewed by a real judge. The judge assigned to the case was U.S. District Judge James Turk. Judge Turk reviewed the lawsuit and issued a written opinion that would later become famous for its unusual and slightly humorous tone. The judge acknowledged that Brock had technically created a unique legal situation. Brock was claiming that he had violated his own civil rights, and therefore he was both the plaintiff and the defendant in the same case. However, the judge ultimately dismissed the case, but not in the way most people would expect. Judge Turk wrote that the reason the case could not proceed was because Brock could not serve as both plaintiff and defendant at the same time. But then the judge added something interesting. He noted that if Brock had been able to properly serve himself with legal papers, the case might have been allowed to proceed. This strange detail led to the widespread story that Brock had won the case, or at least that the judge had acknowledged that the legal argument was not completely impossible, just procedurally flawed. The judge even pointed out that Brock, as a prisoner, was unable to serve himself legal papers, which meant the case could not move forward. The story became famous because it highlighted something unusual about the legal system. Courts are required to review cases based on legal procedure and legal reasoning, not just on whether a case sounds ridiculous. Even a strange case has to be considered under the law. But the story of Robert Lee Brock is not just a funny legal story. It actually reveals something important about the legal system in the United States. The courts are designed so that almost anyone can file a lawsuit, even prisoners, and even people representing themselves. This is part of the idea that the legal system should be accessible to everyone, not just people with lawyers or money. However, cases like Brock's also led to concerns about frivolous lawsuits, especially from prisoners who had time to file many lawsuits. In response to this growing problem, the United States passed the Prison Litigation Reform Act in 1996, which made it more difficult for prisoners to file frivolous lawsuits without consequences. The Brock case became one of the examples often cited when people talked about the need for reform. It showed how the legal system could be used in unusual ways and how courts had to spend time and resources reviewing cases that had little chance of success. What makes this story interesting is not just the lawsuit itself, but the judge's response. Instead of simply dismissing the case as ridiculous, Judge Turk treated it seriously and explained exactly why it could not proceed. His written opinion became famous because it showed the balance that courts try to maintain between allowing access to the legal system and preventing abuse of that system. The case also became popular in law schools as an example of legal procedure. It demonstrated how lawsuits work, how defendants must be served with legal papers, and why legal procedure is just as important as legal arguments. In a strange way, Robert Lee Brock's lawsuit did succeed in one sense. It did not result in $5 million, and it did not change his prison sentence, but it did become one of the most famous unusual court cases in American history. It is still discussed today because it raises an unusual question. What happens when someone tries to use the legal system in a way that no one ever expected? The story is a reminder that the legal system is built on rules and procedures, and those rules must be followed no matter who files the case or how unusual the case may be. The court could not simply ignore Brock's lawsuit. It had to be reviewed, analyzed, and formally dismissed according to legal procedure. The story of Robert Lee Brock is sometimes told as a joke, but it actually illustrates something serious about the legal system. It shows that the courts are open to everyone, but it also shows that the system relies on rules and procedures to function properly. In the end, Brock did not receive $5 million, and the state of Virginia did not pay him for violating his own civil rights. But his case became famous because it demonstrated the strange situations that can arise when the law is applied exactly as written. The case also reminds us that the legal system is not always about dramatic courtroom battles or major corporate lawsuits. Sometimes, the most interesting legal stories come from small, unusual cases that reveal how the system really works behind the scenes. Robert Lee Brock set out to file a lawsuit that sounded impossible, and in the end, the court showed that while the law allows many things, it still has limits. And sometimes, those limits are discovered in the most unusual ways. The case of the man who sued himself and almost won remains one of the strangest legal stories in American history, not because of the money involved or the crime, but because it forced a court to seriously consider a case where a man claimed he had wronged himself and wanted compensation for it. And for a brief moment, the legal system had to treat that argument as a real case, which is what makes the story so unusual and so memorable.